She used to be Chicago's best emergency room nurse, one who saved dozens of lives every week. But tonight, she's kneeling on the cold marble floor, her hands trembling as she wipes away the bloodstains from the mansion of New York's most feared Mafia boss. No one knew she was on the run. No one knew she had a newborn baby lying alone in a small room across the city. And no one knew the man who wanted to kill her, the most powerful man in America, was hunting her. Until tonight. Like and comment with the name of the city you're viewing from. Let me know how far this story has come. The marble was cold through the knees of her uniform pants, and Evelyn Ward had learned to be grateful for small discomforts like that. Cold meant she was still alive. Cold meant she was still here, still breathing, still invisible in the way that survival required. She pressed the rag harder into the stain, watching the deep red bleed into the white fibers. Wine, she told herself. Just wine. She'd been telling herself that lie for 3 months now, telling herself that the discoloration on the floors of the Castelli estate was always wine, never anything darker, because the alternative was thinking too hard about where she had landed and why, and thinking too hard about either of those things was a luxury she couldn't afford. The grandfather clock in the corridor struck 2 in the morning. The last of the guests had left an hour ago. Senators and judges and men whose names appeared on the sides of hospital wings, all of them kissing cheeks and clasping hands with men who made people disappear. The distinction between those two groups had never been as clean as she once believed. She understood that now in a way she hadn't at 28, when she'd been engaged to someone who occupied both categories at once. She wrung the rag over the bucket and watched the water go pink. Don't think about it. The estate hummed with the kind of quiet that expensive places have after expensive people leave. Not silence exactly, but the absence of performance, the building settling back into its actual self. Somewhere above her, a door closed. Footsteps moved across hardwood. She kept her head down and worked the rag in slow circles, the way she'd trained herself to move through rooms like a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. 3 months of practice. She was getting good at it. She'd been a trauma nurse for 6 years at Cook County before everything collapsed. Level 1 trauma center, 40-hour shifts that felt like 60. Patients arriving broken in every way the human body could be broken. She had been good at the work in a way that went beyond training. Some innate ability to stay calm in the middle of catastrophe, to find the still center of herself when everything around her was screaming. Her attending physician said she had the steadiest hands they'd ever seen on someone her age. Grant had called it coldness, later. Said it made her difficult to love. She hadn't understood then that he was cataloging her flaws for future use. The rag snagged on a chip in the marble, and she paused, pressing her fingertips into the floor. 8 months pregnant, she had crawled across a floor that looked something like this one, the limestone entryway of the Holloway townhouse on North State Parkway, the one with the original crown molding and the Basquiat in the foyer and the neighbor who'd called the ambulance after hearing her scream. She had pressed her hands flat against the cold stone to stop herself from shaking, and she had made herself a single promise before the paramedics arrived. Noah would never know that floor. Noah would never know that house. Noah would never know his father's hands. She stood, rolled her neck until it cracked, and moved the bucket to the adjacent hallway. She almost didn't hear him. The voice came from the top of the staircase, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had never needed to raise itself to command a room. Why would a woman with surgical training clean floors for minimum wage? Evelyn went still. She didn't look up immediately. That was instinct by now. When you didn't know the shape of the threat, you didn't give away that you'd heard it. She made herself finish the motion she'd already started, setting the bucket down against the baseboard with a soft ceramic click, and only then did she straighten and look toward the stairs. Luca DeSantis stood at the landing above her. She'd seen him before, the way the staff always saw him, in peripheral glimpses, the back of a dark suit moving through a doorway, a profile backlit by the study window, a pair of hands folded over a dinner table at the far end of a room she was paid not to linger in. The pictures in the newspapers never quite captured what he actually looked like. The photographers always caught the severity, the hard jaw, the controlled stillness of his expression, but they missed the thing underneath it, the quality that made experienced men take a half step backward when he entered a space without being able to explain why they'd done it. He was 36 years old, and he looked like someone who had never been surprised by anything. Not once, not in his entire life. He was still wearing the jacket from the evening. No tie now, collar open, a faint trace of rain on the shoulders where he'd been outside at some point. He held a glass of whiskey loosely in his right hand, and he was looking at her with an expression that wasn't quite curiosity. Too careful for that. Too deliberate. More like a man who had already assembled the answer to his own question and was now waiting to see if she would try to give him a different one. "I'm not sure what you mean," Evelyn said. "The way you cleaned the arterial spray off the baseboard in the east hallway 3 weeks ago." He descended 2 steps, unhurried. "You used direct pressure on the grout lines. Hospital instinct. Someone who'd spent time around blood learns which way the fibers go." He paused. "It's not an accusation. It's an observation." She kept her face neutral. 6 years of trauma nursing had given her practice at that too, at presenting a calm surface while her internal systems ran full tilt beneath it, calculating, recalculating, mapping exit routes and worst-case scenarios. Her heart was doing something unpleasant at a high rate of speed. She kept her breathing slow. "I worked in healthcare a few years ago," she said. "I changed careers." He descended the remaining stairs without particular hurry, stopping at the base of the landing where the corridor opened into the main hall. From this angle, she was aware of the distance between herself and the servant's entrance. 40 feet, maybe 45, through a door she'd need both hands to unlatch. "What was your name before Evelyn Marsh?" The name she'd been using. The documents she'd paid $4,000 for in a parking garage off Western Avenue, handed to her by a man with kind eyes who told her to memorize everything and throw away the paper. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. The distant cousin of one, maybe. "I'm not going to cause you a problem," he said. "I want to be clear about that before we go any further. Whatever you're running from, you're not running from me." He lifted the whiskey glass slightly, a gesture that managed to be both casual and precise. "But there are things I know about your situation that I think you need to hear, and I'm going to need you to decide tonight whether you're willing to have that conversation." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The house was silent around them. Rain had started again outside, ticking against the tall windows, and the sound of it was the only thing between her and the specific quality of stillness that she associated with danger. "What kind of things?" she said. "The kind that tell me you have less time than you think." She didn't sleep that night. She went back to the small apartment on Delancey Street when her shift ended at 4, let herself in quietly, and stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long time watching Noah sleep. He was 4 months old, and he slept with his fists curled against his cheeks the way she imagined all newborns slept, though she hadn't known any other newborns. She'd delivered babies in the trauma bay before. Emergencies, complications, mothers who'd come in crisis. But she hadn't understood until Noah that the act of watching a small person breathe could contain the entirety of everything you had left to lose. She made herself go to the kitchen and drink a glass of water standing up. Her hands were shaking. She turned them over and studied them. Steady hands. That was what the attendings had said. Steadiest hands we've seen. The irony of that felt like something she would have laughed at a different version of herself. The version who had believed steadiness was a character trait rather than a performance you gave until your legs gave out. She tried to reconstruct what Luca DeSantis had said, parsing it for threat rather than information. "I'm not going to cause you a problem." That was what men said before they caused you a problem. She'd learned that lesson in a limestone entryway with her face against the cold floor. But there had been something in the way he said it. Men who were about to leverage something held the information differently. There was a quality of weight in their posture, a subtle forward lean, the way the body unconsciously positioned itself to receive something in return. Luca had stood at a distance she could not call crowding, and his voice had carried none of the compressed excitement of someone who believed they held a hand. He had sounded, genuinely, like someone delivering bad news they hadn't asked to deliver. She didn't know what to do with that. She went back to bed and lay on top of the covers with her clothes on, staring at the watermark on the ceiling, and slept in 40-minute intervals until Noah woke at 7. So, the next evening she returned to the estate for her shift and found a note in her locker. 3 words in handwriting that was spare and exact. "My study? 9. She thought about not going. She thought about it for the entire shift, scrubbing bathrooms, polishing silver, stripping the beds in the third-floor guest suite, running through the decision the way she used to run through a differential in the trauma bay. Worst case outcome if you act. Worst case outcome if you don't. What information do you actually have versus what you're inferring? What she had. A man who knew she wasn't who she said she was, who had been specific enough about the arterial spray and the grout lines that she understood the extent of his surveillance, who had access to investigative resources she couldn't begin to quantify, and who had, deliberately and without apparent agenda, declined to use any of that information as leverage. What she was inferring, that whatever he knew about Grant Holloway had arrived at the same conclusion she had spent 18 months trying to reach, that she was running out of runway. She went to the study at 9. The room was dark except for the lamp on the desk and the city's glow pushing against the windows. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, dark wood, the faint smell of leather, and something older underneath it. Not tobacco, not damp, but the specific smell of a room that had witnessed serious conversations over many decades. A drinks cabinet against the far wall. A desk that was large and clear of clutter in the way that power desks always were, communicating that the work happened elsewhere. Luca was sitting in a chair to one side of the desk rather than behind it, which surprised her in a way she couldn't immediately explain. He was wearing different clothes than the night before. No suit jacket, dark shirt, sleeves pushed to the elbow. He looked like someone who had been sitting in that chair for a while, doing something difficult. He didn't stand when she came in. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat, did not lean back, kept her weight forward, her feet flat on the floor. "How did you find me?" she said. First question, best question. "You interviewed here under a name that didn't exist 6 months ago," he said. "My head of household does background checks. The documents were good enough to pass the surface check, but I run a different kind of operation." He paused. "I had a name by the second week." "My real name." "Your real name." She held that for a moment. "And you didn't do anything with it." "I wanted to understand the situation before I did anything with it." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, and looked at her directly. "Evelyn Ward, Cook County Hospital, engaged 18 months ago to Grant Holloway, heir to the Holloway Political Foundation. Disappeared at 8 months pregnant following a domestic incident that was reported to the CPD as a fall. The case was closed within 48 hours. He said it flatly, without inflection, the way you would recite facts you found sufficiently damning to not require editorializing. Grant Holloway reported you as a missing person 11 months ago. The investigation was conducted by the same detective who handled the original domestic incident report. "Commissioner Faraday," she said. "Faraday played golf with Grant's father for 23 years. He sat back. "I know." She had known most of what he was saying. She had assembled the same picture from different angles in a different city with fewer resources. The familiarity of it didn't make it easier to hear said aloud, in a stranger's voice, in a stranger's study, in a city she'd chosen specifically because she knew no one there. "What don't I know?" she said. Something moved in his expression. "Grant is in New York," he said. "He's been here for 2 weeks. He hired a private investigator who was getting close." He paused, and the pause had a quality she recognized, the practiced hesitation of someone who was about to say something they knew would land badly. "The investigator is no longer working the case." She understood what that meant. "He'll hire another one," she said. "He already did." "How much time do I have?" "Less than a week, probably. Maybe 3 days." He looked at her steadily. "The PI he retained this time is better. He has a photograph from the pharmacy on Orchard Street. You and your son." The air went out of the room. She made herself breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd taught panicking patients to breathe when their world was collapsing and breath was the only thing left in her arsenal. She made her hands stay flat on her thighs. "What do you want from me?" she said. It didn't come out as a question. "Nothing you're thinking," he said. "I'm going to offer you something, and I want you to listen to the whole thing before you respond." She waited. "Grant Holloway is protected in ways that make conventional options difficult," he said. "His father's political network extends to the federal bench in 3 circuits. The DA's office in Chicago has taken money from the foundation for 12 years. You could go to the police and you know exactly what would happen." She knew. She'd mapped it out in the hospital, lying there with 4 broken ribs and a ruptured spleen and a story the detective had written down in the wrong order. What I'm proposing is protection of a different kind, Luca continued. Visible protection. The kind that makes Grant Holloway understand immediately that attacking you would carry consequences he's not equipped to manage. He looked at her directly. Move into this estate. Bring your son. Allow me to introduce you publicly as my fiancé. She stared at him. I understand how that sounds, he said. You want me to pretend... I want Grant Holloway to believe that any action he takes against you will be answered by me. That's the only language he'll understand. Men who are protected by institutional power respond to exactly one thing, and that thing is a power they can't navigate around. He said it simply. I am that power in this city. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the rain was heavier now, hitting the windows in sheets. Why? She said. He seemed to consider whether to answer. Because I know what the Holloway Foundation actually is, he said finally, and I have reasons of my own for wanting it dismantled. It wasn't the complete answer. She could tell. But it was enough of a corner of the complete answer that she could see its shape. She thought about Noah, 4 months old, sleeping with his fists against his cheeks. She thought about 3 days. There are conditions, she said. Tell me. My son is not a prop. He doesn't appear in photographs. He doesn't get used for optics. And if anything in this arrangement puts him at increased risk, it ends. Immediately. Agreed. I want my own room. I want a key to the exterior doors. Already standard. The staff has keys. I want to know if you're planning anything that directly affects my safety or his. She held his gaze. I don't care what else you do. I don't need to know how your operation runs. But if something's coming that I need to prepare for, I want to be told. He held her gaze back. She had the impression that people didn't often give him a list of conditions, and that his response to it was something other than irritation. That's reasonable, he said. One more thing. She paused. You said you know what the Holloway Foundation actually is, the trafficking connections, the shell organizations overseas. She kept her voice level. I have documentation, copied files. I took them before I left. Something shifted in the quality of his attention, and she understood in that moment exactly what quality of man she was sitting across from. Not because of the stillness that settled over him, but because of the careful, deliberate way he held himself back from reacting. Where? He said. Somewhere safe. She stood. If the arrangement works, we discuss it. If it doesn't, it stays where it is. She left the study before he could respond, walked back through the dark corridor to the servants' entrance, and stood outside in the rain for 2 full minutes, letting the cold water run down the back of her neck. Her hands were perfectly still. She hated that about herself, sometimes. She moved in 3 days later. The room they gave her was on the 2nd floor, northeast corner, with 2 windows overlooking the garden and a connecting door to the smaller room that became Noah's. There were new locks on both doors. She noticed them before she noticed anything else, which told her something about the past 18 months of her life that she already knew but didn't like to enumerate. She had 2 bags and a portable crib and a box of Noah's things, and she stood in the middle of the room holding him against her shoulder, while one of Luca's men carried things up the stairs, and she looked at the city through the window and tried to identify what she was feeling. Not safe. Safety was a story she no longer believed in, but something adjacent to it. The possibility of air, maybe. The possibility of a problem that was shared rather than entirely hers. Noah made a noise against her collar. I know, she said softly. I know. The first public appearance happened 4 days later. A dinner at a restaurant in Midtown that belonged, the head of household told her, to someone who owed Luca a very large favor. Private room, 12 guests, no cameras in the dining area itself. But the arrival and departure would be photographed because in New York, arrivals and departures at certain addresses were always photographed. They gave her a dress she would not have chosen. Deep navy, structured, expensive. And a woman named Petra who materialized in her room at 6 and performed alterations to Evelyn's face that she would not have known how to perform herself. The ring appeared on the dressing table beside her without explanation. A 3-carat oval diamond set in platinum, simple in a way that communicated its own extravagance. She picked it up and held it for a moment. The last ring she'd worn had been given to her on the rooftop of the Art Institute with champagne and photographs, and her future mother-in-law crying happy tears into a silk handkerchief. She had loved it with the uncomplicated love of someone who had not yet learned what love could cost. She put Luca's ring on her finger and looked at herself in the mirror. A stranger looked back. A polished, assembled stranger who stood with good posture in a navy dress and wore diamonds without flinching. Evelyn Ward would have laughed at her. Evelyn Marsh, the woman she'd spent a year pretending to be, was too frightened to recognize herself. She didn't know which one of them would be walking into that restaurant. But Luca met her at the base of the stairs. He was wearing a black suit, and he looked at her the way people looked at things they were assessing for potential complications, efficiently, without making her feel assessed. He straightened the sleeve of his jacket and offered her his arm in a gesture that managed to be simultaneously formal and ordinary, as if they had done this many times. "Is there anything you need before we leave?" he said. "No. Noah is with Celia. She's been with my household for 9 years. You can call from anywhere." She had already called. She had called while Petra was doing her hair and checked twice while she got dressed. She nodded. "When we're outside," he said, "you don't need to perform anything. You only need to be present. Let me lead the physical blocking. If someone approaches you directly, look at me before you answer." He paused. "If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you touch my arm and we leave." She looked at him. "That's it?" "That's it." He opened the front door, and the cold air hit her face, and the cameras flashed from the end of the driveway where photographers stood behind the gate, and Luca's hand was at the small of her back, present, steady, uninsistent, and she walked forward into the lights and thought, so this is how it starts. Across town, in a penthouse on the 63rd floor of a building she didn't know existed, Grant Holloway sat across from a man in a gray suit and looked at a photograph on a tablet screen. Evelyn. Clear resolution. Noah in her arms. He set the tablet down on the table between them and was quiet for a moment. "How long has she been with DeSantis?" he said. The man in the gray suit glanced at his notes. 3 days officially, but there's evidence of earlier contact. He knew about her before she moved in. Grant was quiet again, turning something over. "She told him," he said finally. The man waited. "She told him about the foundation." Grant's jaw worked. "She must have. Otherwise, why would he touch her? She has nothing. She's nobody. But if she gave him documentation..." He stopped. The man in the gray suit said nothing, because he was paid to provide information and not opinions. Grant stood up and walked to the window and looked out over the city. The lights of New York spread out below him in all directions, indifferent and enormous. He had spent 11 months telling himself she was frightened and alone, that she would run out of resources and come back or be found and brought back and the problem would resolve itself. He had been patient, which was not in his nature, and he had told himself patience was the right approach. He understood now that he'd been wrong. She hadn't been running. She had been building. "I want to meet with DeSantis," he said. The man in the gray suit looked up. "That's not..." "I didn't ask for your assessment." Grant turned from the window. His face had rearranged itself into something flatter and harder, the face that appeared behind closed doors and never in photographs. "Set it up, and find me everything you have on the DeSantis operation, every pressure point, every exposure, every person he trusts." He picked up the tablet again, looked at the photograph one more time. If she thinks hiding behind a monster is going to protect her, she needs to understand something. He set the tablet face down on the table. "I'm the reason monsters exist." The photograph ran in 3 papers by morning. Not front page, below the fold in the society column, the kind of placement that looked accidental and wasn't. A single frame. Luca DeSantis exiting a black car outside Vittorio's on 54th, his hand at the back of a woman in a dark navy dress who was not looking at the camera. The woman's face was angled just enough toward the light to be identifiable to someone who knew her. The caption read, "DeSantis seen with unidentified companion at private dinner Thursday. Sources close to the family confirm engagement rumors." Evelyn found it on her phone at 6:15 in the morning, before Noah woke, sitting in the window seat of her room with the radiator ticking beside her and the city's gray early light pressing against the glass. She read the caption twice. She looked at the photograph. At herself, technically, though the woman in the frame had a posture she didn't recognize, a certain set to her shoulders that read as belonging somewhere. And then she set the phone face down on the cushion and breathed. One day at a time. That was the only math that worked. She could hear Noah beginning to stir in the next room, the specific quality of pre-cry sounds he made before he committed to actually crying. A series of small protests and adjustments. She went to him and lifted him out of the portable crib and held him against her chest while he decided whether the morning was acceptable. And she stood by the window in the gray light and looked out over the garden, and did not think about the photograph in 3 newspapers and the man 63 floors above the city who had seen them. She thought about the documentation instead. The files she had copied from Grant's study 8 days before she left Chicago, 14 months ago now, though it felt like a different lifetime measured in different units. Flash drive, encrypted, sitting inside a fake electrical outlet she'd installed herself in the apartment on Delancey Street. The apartment she'd vacated 3 days ago. The apartment that was now sitting empty with a new tenant moving in on the 1st. She had not retrieved the drive before she moved. That had been a miscalculation, and she knew it. She brought it up with Luca at 8 in the kitchen, which was the only room in the estate where the formality dropped to something approximating normal. The housekeeper, Mrs. Caruso, had learned within 24 hours of Evelyn's arrival that Noah required a specific temperature for his formula and had adjusted her morning routine accordingly without comment, and Evelyn had decided on the basis of that single adjustment that Mrs. Caruso was a person worth being honest with, in the limited ways she could afford honesty. Luca was at the counter with coffee and a newspaper, an actual physical newspaper, which she noted as the kind of detail that told you something about a person, and he looked up when she came in. "There's a problem," she said. He folded the paper. "Tell me." "I left something at the apartment, something important." She shifted Noah on her hip. "I need to go back today." He was quiet for a moment. "The documentation." It didn't surprise her that he'd worked it out. "I didn't have time to get it before the move. I thought I'd go back within the first couple of days, but the new tenant moves in today." "Yes." He picked up his coffee. "I'll send someone." "No." She said it flat. "I need to go myself. The concealment isn't obvious. Someone who doesn't know what they're looking for won't find it." He looked at her across the counter. He had a way of looking at people that didn't feel like observation. It felt like calculation, though not the cold kind. The kind that was actually paying attention. She held the eye contact. "Ricci will drive you," he said. "You don't go anywhere without someone in the next 48 hours. That's non-negotiable." "Fine." "How long will it take?" 10 minutes inside? Maybe less?" He nodded once and looked back at his coffee, and she understood that the conversation was over and that she had gotten what she needed, and she stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, adjusting Noah in her arms, and tried to identify the feeling that came with winning a small argument against a man who could have ended the argument differently. She didn't have a name for it. The apartment on Delancey looked smaller than she remembered it, the way places always looked smaller when you had already emotionally vacated them. The new tenant's boxes were stacked in the hallway outside the door, which meant she had a window of maybe an hour before the super showed up with the handover keys. Ricci waited in the car downstairs without being asked. She'd told him she needed 5 minutes, and he'd looked at the building and the block and made his own assessment and said, "I'll be here," which was what she would have said. She moved quickly through the apartment, checked the closet out of habit, the bathroom, the strip of baseboard she'd used to store cash. The cash was already gone. She'd taken it in stages over the preceding weeks, a habit of gradual withdrawal she'd developed after Chicago. You didn't leave anything in one place that you couldn't afford to lose. The outlet was in the bedroom behind the nightstand. She pulled the nightstand out, found the plate, found the recessed cavity, found the drive. She held it in her palm for a second. 14 months of carrying this thing as an abstraction. The idea of it, the knowledge that it existed, the way you held a life insurance policy in your head without actually looking at the document. She had looked at the contents once, the night she copied them, sitting in the car outside the Holloway townhouse in the dark, while Grant slept 3 floors above her. She had scrolled through transfer records, shell company registrations, correspondence between Holloway Foundation officers and overseas entities whose names she'd later identified as trafficking front organizations. She had looked until she felt sick, and then she had encrypted the drive and told herself it was insurance. Insurance against what? She hadn't let herself finish the thought. She put it in her pocket and pushed the nightstand back. She was in the car with Ricci 2 minutes later, and it wasn't until they were 3 blocks from the estate that she let herself exhale completely. She did not notice the black sedan that had been parked half a block down from her building since 7 that morning. She did not notice it pull out when Ricci pulled out, or maintain exactly the right distance through 4 turns, or stop 1 block short of the estate gate and sit there for 11 minutes before moving on. The dinner invitation arrived that afternoon. Formal stationery, delivered by hand, addressed to Mr. Luca DeSantis and guest. The Astoria Crown Hotel Charity Foundation Annual Gala, black tie, the following Friday. Evelyn watched Luca hold the envelope for a moment before setting it on his desk, and she understood from the quality of his stillness that the invitation was not a social occasion. "Holloway?" she said. "His father-in-law sits on the foundation board." Luca set the envelope down. "It's a stage. He wants to see you in person. He wants to take your measure when you can't run. You're going to accept." "Yes." She stood in the doorway of the study and looked at him. He was at the desk now, turned slightly away from her, and the afternoon light from the window cut across the desk surface and made the room look like a different century. "You could have told me instead of letting me figure it out from your face," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite an acknowledgement. "I'm still assessing how much advance warning is useful to you," he said. "Some people function better without it. I function better with information. I'm learning that." He looked at her directly now. "The gala will be covered. There will be photographers outside and press inside. It will be the first significant public appearance, and it will tell Grant Holloway everything he needs to know about what he's dealing with." He paused. "I need you to understand what that means. It means I have to be convincing. It means you have to be present, completely present, not managing your own fear on the side." He said it without gentleness, but not without consideration. "If he sees you performing, he'll understand the arrangement is performance. And if he understands that, I know what he'll do." She said it sharply. "You don't need to finish that." He didn't. She left the study and went upstairs and stood in the bathroom with the door closed and the tap running and both hands on the edge of the sink, looking at herself in the mirror the way she sometimes had to, forcing herself to hold the eye contact, making herself stay there until she could see something behind her own eyes that wasn't just fear running system checks. She thought about Grant's hands on her arms, the specific architecture of that kind of grip. Not passion, not even anger, just utility. The grip of someone who understood that your body was an object he had the right to reposition. She had learned to catalog physical contact by its grammar. What the hand said, what the pressure communicated, what came next. Luca's hand at her back outside the restaurant had said something entirely different. She turned the tap off. That was a dangerous thing to notice, and she filed it somewhere she didn't intend to return to. Petra came on Wednesday to fit the dress for Friday. It was deep silver. Someone had made that choice deliberately, she suspected, the way choices in Luca's world were generally made, structured at the shoulder and fluid from the waist, the kind of dress that read as armor until it moved. Evelyn stood on the low-fitting platform in her room while Petra worked pins in silence, and she held herself still with the specific stillness of someone whose body had learned stillness as a survival mechanism. "You've done this before," Petra said. Not a question. "Stood still while someone pinned fabric? Worn a version of yourself that wasn't the real one?" Petra's voice was neutral. She pulled a pin from between her teeth and worked it into the side seam. "It shows a particular way. Most people fidget." Evelyn said nothing. "The ring sits correctly," Petra said, glancing at her left hand. "You wear it like it belongs there." "I was engaged once." Petra nodded as if this confirmed something. "The first one always teaches you how." She left the room at 5 without elaborating, and Evelyn stood in the silver dress and looked at herself in the long mirror and thought that Petra was either perceptive or she had worked for Luca long enough that she understood the specific grammar of women who arrived in his house carrying damage they hadn't asked for. Probably both. Thursday brought rain and a complication she hadn't anticipated. His name was Marco Vasile, and he was Luca's head of operations, and he had been watching Evelyn with a quality of attention she identified immediately as threat assessment, not the sexual appraisal she was used to navigating, something colder, more procedural, the way a border agent looked at a passport photo versus the face in front of them, searching for discrepancy. He found her in the first-floor corridor at 2 in the afternoon, which she did not believe was accidental. Ms. Marsh, he said, using the name he'd been given, which meant either he didn't know her real one or he was choosing not to use it for reasons of his own. Mr. Vasile. He was 40, compact, with a face that was not unkind and eyes that were not warm. The combination gave him the appearance of someone who had made deliberate decisions about which aspects of himself to cultivate. He fell into step beside her, unhurried. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. "People who want to be straightforward usually are without announcing it first." A slight pause. "Fair point." He slowed slightly and she matched it. Luca makes decisions quickly. He decides something is the right move and he executes it. He's usually right, but usually isn't always. If you're asking whether this is a mistake, I'm not asking you anything. He stopped walking and she stopped too. They were by the window at the end of the corridor, rain moving in sheets outside. "I've been with Luca for 12 years. I've watched him make 3 decisions out of something other than strategy. 2 of them cost him." He looked at her directly. "I want to know if you understand what you're putting him in the middle of." She looked at him back. "He put himself in the middle of it." "He did, and that's what concerns me." He let that sit for a moment. The Holloway family doesn't fight clean. They fight institutional. They'll look for exposure in his operation, regulation, federal investigation, leverage through political allies. They'll try to make being connected to you more costly than whatever he's getting out of the arrangement. He's getting access to documentation that dismantles their trafficking network. He's getting something more than that, or he wouldn't have moved you into the house. He said it without accusation, just precision. "I've known him a long time. I know the difference." She kept her expression even. "What do you want from this conversation?" "I want you to be worth it," he said simply. "I want whatever you're carrying, so the documentation, the exposure, whatever it is, I want it to be enough that when this gets ugly, and it will get ugly, he's holding something that justifies the cost." He paused. "Is it?" She thought about the drive in the inside pocket of her bag upstairs, the 14 months of carrying it, the night she'd sat in the dark car and scrolled through transfer records and felt her world reconfigure itself around the knowledge of what Grant's family actually was. "Yes," she said. Vasily studied her for another moment. Then he nodded, once, the kind of nod that wasn't agreement but was acknowledgement, and he walked back down the corridor and left her by the rain-streaked window. She stood there for a while after he was gone. She had liked him, despite everything. Or maybe because of it. She told Luca about the conversation that evening. He was in the study again. She had the impression he spent most of his evenings in the study, that it was his natural habitat the way a trauma bay had once been hers, and he listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet. "He shouldn't have approached you directly," he said. He was honest. He was concerned. Something moved in his jaw. "Marco's been concerned about me making personal decisions since I was 28 years old. It doesn't mean he's wrong to have the concern, but it's not his call." He said this is more than strategy for you. The silence that followed had a different quality from his other silences. She had, over the past week, become something of a student of his silences. The way some people who spend enough time in hospital environments learn to read vital signs on a monitor without consciously thinking about it, pattern recognition below the level of intention. This one was careful in a way that told her he was deciding something. "Marco is sometimes correct," he said. "Does that change anything for you?" She looked at him across the desk. The lamp threw a warm circle that didn't reach the corners of the room, rain on the windows. The city's lights blurred and distant. I need to know if it compromises your judgment, she said. No. Can I trust that? You can trust that I know the cost of compromised judgment. He held her gaze. I've paid it before. I know what it looks like, and I know how to avoid it. He paused. What I'm doing is strategic. The fact that it's also something else doesn't change that. She accepted that. Not because she believed it completely, but because she believed he believed it, and because she understood in the specific way that people who have survived a certain kind of experience understand things, that there was a category of truth that was only partially accessible from the inside. She went to bed at 11 and lay in the dark, listening to Noah breathe through the monitor, and thought about Friday. The night of the gala came cold and cloudless, the city sharp-edged under a sky that had finally cleared after 4 days of rain. Evelyn stood at the window of her room in the silver dress and watched the cars moving on the street below, and felt the particular alertness that came before a thing you had been dreading. Not quite fear, closer to the preoperative stillness she used to enter before a major procedure, the body gathering itself, clearing the desk. Luca knocked at 7:15. She opened the door. He looked at her for a moment without saying anything, and she had learned enough about his economy of expression by now to understand that the moment meant something, though she did not examine it too closely. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said. "Let's go anyway." Something that was almost a smile. They went. The Astoria Crown Hotel lobby was white marble and engineered light, and 50 years of New York money arranged decoratively around a function room designed to make you feel like power was normal, like being surrounded by it was unremarkable. The Charity Foundation's banner stretched across the mezzanine. Photographers were held back behind a rope line at the entrance, camera flashes firing in bursts as each car arrived. They walked in together, Luca's hand at her back, and the flashes went continuous. She saw him before he saw her. Grant Holloway was standing near the far end of the receiving area with a drink in his hand and the specific posture of someone who had been watching the entrance for a while. He was in black tie, and he looked exactly the way he always looked in formal settings, polished to a point just short of aggressive, handsome in the particular way of men who had always been told they were, which made them handsome in the way of something expected rather than discovered. He had a woman beside him she didn't recognize. His eyes moved across the entrance crowd, and then they found her and stopped. Something happened in his face. It wasn't exactly shock. He'd known she would be here. He'd planned this encounter. But the photograph in the newspaper and the reality of her standing 20 meters away from him in a silver dress on the arm of Luca DeSantis were apparently different scales of the same fact, and his body processed the difference before his expression could catch up with it. She watched his jaw tighten. Luca felt the change in her. She knew he did because his hand shifted slightly at her back, a minimal adjustment of pressure that communicated awareness without drawing attention, and he turned his head a fraction and said very quietly, "Don't look away." She didn't. She held Grant's gaze across the marble room until he was the one who looked away, and she told herself the thing pounding in her chest was adrenaline and nothing else. They did not encounter each other directly for the first 90 minutes. It was choreography, she understood. A room full of powerful people who understood choreography, all of them moving in patterns that looked social and were actually positional. Luca worked the room with the efficiency of someone who disliked the work but understood its necessity, and she moved with him, speaking when spoken to, performing the version of herself that wore this dress and this ring in this room, and she was good at it, which disturbed her in a way she didn't dwell on. She saw Marco Vasile near the bar, not drinking, watching. She caught his eye once. He didn't nod or acknowledge her, just watched. At 10:15, Luca stepped away to speak with a man near the windows. Someone political, from the body language, the careful spacing of their conversation. She was 3 steps to his left with a glass of sparkling water she hadn't drunk, and she was watching a point somewhere past the nearest floral arrangement, and she felt the approach before she heard it. "Grant." "You look well," he said. His voice was exactly the same. She had spent 14 months hearing it in her sleep, and here it was, just the same, just a voice coming from the same direction as always, slightly above and slightly behind, the position he favored. She turned around. "Grant?" He was alone. His woman was somewhere behind him. She could see the edge of the black dress near the dessert table. His face was composed now. He'd had 90 minutes to compose it, but there was something underneath the composition that she recognized because she had spent 3 years learning to read it. The tight thing around his eyes, the specific quality of his stillness when he was working not to show his hands. He was furious. "This is embarrassing," he said quietly. "You understand that, right? Whatever you think this is, I'm not having this conversation. You're going to have it." He took a half step closer, not touching her, the practiced geometry of it, close enough to be intimate and far enough to be deniable. "He doesn't know you, Evelyn. He knows a story about you. The moment he figures out who you actually are, the kind of person who steals private files and runs instead of, 'I didn't steal anything.'" She kept her voice low and even. "I copied documentation of federal crimes. That's called evidence. That's called theft. And you know exactly what happens to the people who try to use it." His voice dropped further. "You have a son. You want to think very carefully about the decisions you make for the next. Don't." The word came out with a specific edge she hadn't entirely planned, hard and certain, and she watched it land on him. "Do not put Noah in this conversation. Ever. For any reason." His expression shifted, and for one moment she saw the thing he usually kept behind the handsomeness. Not anger exactly, more like contempt, the kind that was so practiced it had calcified into something else. "You think he's protecting you?" Grant glanced toward where Luca stood at the windows, then back to her. "He's using you. That's what men like him do. Your leverage. Your documentation he wants access to and a story he can use against my family, and when that's done, you should leave. When that's done, you'll be exactly where you were, alone, scared, and this time there won't be anywhere left to run." She looked at him steadily. Her heart was doing the same fast, terrible thing it always did around him, but her hands were still. She checked, could feel them still at her sides, and she looked him in the eyes and said nothing, because she had learned that the most destabilizing response to Grant Holloway was silence. He waited for her to break it. She didn't. Something shifted in his face, and he adjusted his jacket, and he was about to say something else when a hand came down on his shoulder. Not Luca. "Vasile." "Mr. Holloway." Vasile's voice was pleasant in a way that contained nothing pleasant. "I don't think we've been introduced." Grant looked at the hand on his shoulder. He looked at Vasile. He made the calculation that most people made when they encountered Marco Vasile in this configuration, and he smoothed his expression and stepped back. "No," he said, "we haven't. Enjoy the rest of your evening." Vasile said it without inflection, and it landed exactly as intended. Grant walked away. Evelyn exhaled once, controlled. Vasile stood beside her for a moment without saying anything, watching Grant's back. "You handled that well," he said. "I've had practice." "I know." He paused. "Luca's on his way back. He didn't see it. He was turned away. You don't have to tell him." She looked at Vasile. "I'll tell him." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite approval, something quieter than that. "Good," he said, and moved away. She told Luca in the car on the way back. All of it, in order, without editorializing. She watched his face in the intermittent light of passing street lamps while she spoke. The planes of it going very still, the jaw tightening once, a quality of controlled something filling the space behind his eyes that she had not seen in him before in quite that concentration. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "He threatened Noah directly," he said. "Implied. He didn't say his name. He said, 'Your son.'" "Yes." Another silence. The car moved through the city. She watched his hands on his thigh. Not a gesture, just where they rested, still and deliberate. "I need to know something," he said. "Ask." "The documentation, the drive." He looked at her. "Is it enough?" "On its own, independent of anything I can add to it, is it enough to end them?" She thought about the files, the transfer records, the names and numbers and dates, the correspondence that tied foundation officers to organizations that moved people across borders in shipping containers. "It's enough for federal indictment," she said. "It's enough for complete institutional destruction. But it would need to be delivered to the right people, and the right people would need protection to act on it, because the Holloway network extends into the judiciary. Luca nodded slowly. He was somewhere she couldn't quite follow, some internal place where he was running his own calculations, mapping something she didn't have the coordinates for. After Friday, he said, almost to himself. What happens after Friday? He looked at her. Grant Holloway came to this city to take something back, he said. Tonight he looked at you in a room full of people who matter in this city, and he understood for the first time that he can't. He paused. That's going to make him do something reckless. People like him always do something reckless when they realize the conventional routes are closed. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. I need him to do it on my timeline and in a place I control. She looked at him for a long moment. You're setting a trap, she said. I'm letting him walk into one. He turned back to the window. There's a difference. The car turned onto the block approaching the estate. The gates were lit. Two men she'd learned were always there were at their positions, and the sight of the building, solid, lit, its windows warm, produced something in her chest that she was careful not to examine too closely. Evelyn, she turned. His face was unreadable in the half-dark of the car, but there was something in the way he said her name, the real one, the one he'd known before she'd told him, that landed differently from the way everything else did. I want you to understand something, he said. What Holloway said tonight, about what I am and what I want from this arrangement. He held her gaze. He was right that I'm not a simple man. He was wrong about everything else. She didn't answer. She didn't trust what she might answer. The car stopped. The door opened. She stepped out into the cold air of the estate and heard Luca behind her and walked toward the lit front entrance and told herself she needed to sleep. She needed to think clearly. She needed to not stand in darkened cars having conversations that moved the furniture around inside her chest. She was halfway to the door when her phone buzzed. She stopped. Unknown number. A text message, 3 words and an address. Check your apartment. She stood in the cold and read it twice. The apartment on Delancey was empty, had been empty for 4 days. There was nothing left there. She'd checked everything, she'd taken everything that mattered, she'd stood in the middle of each room and done a full account. Except. She had checked for what she knew to look for, not for what someone else might have left behind. Luca had come up beside her. He read the message over her shoulder without asking permission, and she felt the quality of his stillness change, become something denser, more purposeful, the way air changed before weather. Don't go, he said. It could be... It's Holloway. His voice was flat. It's a message, or it's a trap. Either way, it's him. Her hand tightened around the phone. Her mind went to the apartment, the layout, the closet, the outlet behind the nightstand. She had the drive. She had taken the drive. There was nothing there he could use. Unless he hadn't been looking for what she'd left, unless he'd been leaving something for her to find. He was in my apartment, she said. The certainty of it arrived without announcement. The black sedan she hadn't noticed that morning, the 11 minutes it had sat outside the gate. She had walked into that building and spent 7 minutes inside and walked back out with the drive in her pocket, and she had been watched the entire time. Not to stop her, to see her, to confirm she was there, to confirm the drive existed, to... He knows I have the files, she said. Luca's hand was on her arm. Not restraining, present. Come inside, he said. She looked at the text one more time. 3 words. Check your apartment. Not a question, not a demand. A message delivered with the particular confidence of someone who had already moved the pieces to where he wanted them, who was now simply informing you of the new shape of the board, who wanted you to know that while you had been performing safety in a silver dress in a charity ballroom, he had been somewhere else entirely, doing something you hadn't seen coming. Grant Holloway hadn't come to New York to argue. He had come to take everything, and tonight, standing outside a house that wasn't hers, holding a phone with a message from a man who had once put her on a limestone floor, Evelyn Ward understood with terrible clarity that the trap Luca had been planning to set had already been... Luca's hand closed around her arm, and she let him pull her inside because her legs were doing the thing they sometimes did. Not shaking exactly, more like the structural certainty going out of them, the way a building felt before it settled. And she walked through the front entrance of the estate and heard the door close behind them and stood in the foyer under the lights, while the warmth of the house pressed against her cold face. Vasile was already there. She didn't ask how. She had stopped asking how Vasile knew things. It was a feature of him, like his compact stillness and his eyes that were always doing something more than looking. "The apartment," Luca said. "I know." Vasile was looking at his phone. "Ricci's already on the way. I've got 2 more going around the back." He glanced up. "You should both be inside until we know what's there." Evelyn was still holding her phone. The text message was still on the screen book. "Check your apartment." And she was reading it for the 4th time the way you read something terrible repeatedly, hoping the meaning will shift. "He was in there this morning," she said. "Before I went. The sedan. I didn't notice it. I walked right past it." "You weren't supposed to notice it," Vasile said. "Not unkind, just accurate." "What did he leave?" Luca said. "We don't know yet." "Then make a guess." Vasile paused, the minimal pause of a man who did not like to speculate but understood when speculation was required. If it was a device, it was already in place before she retrieved the drive, which means he watched her retrieve it. If he wanted to destroy it, he would have taken it then. He didn't, which means he wants her to have it. He looked at Evelyn. "Which means either it's now compromised in some way, or he left something that tells a different story about what's on it." The cold moved from her face to the center of her chest. "He could have copied it," she said. "If he had access to the apartment before I—" "The drive was encrypted," Luca said. "He has people who break encryption." She said it flatly. "He has a technology division inside the Foundation. I knew about it before I left. They were using it to sanitize internal communications." She looked at Luca. "If he had even 2 days with the apartment before this morning—" "He's had 4, Vasile said. The silence that followed that sentence was the specific silence of people absorbing a number that changes the shape of everything. 4 days. She had moved in 4 days ago. The apartment had been empty, ostensibly empty, apparently empty, for 4 days, and she had walked back into it that morning and spent 7 minutes inside and walked out believing she had the only copy of the thing she'd been carrying for 14 months, and the entire time. "He could have altered the files," she said. Luca's head came up. "If he had the drive and enough time, he could have modified the transfer records, changed the names, the dates, the account numbers, made them point somewhere else." She heard her own voice doing the thing it did in the trauma bay, flat and procedural, processing information she couldn't afford to feel yet. "If I hand that drive to a federal prosecutor and the files have been altered, it doesn't just fail to convict them, it convicts me. Evidence tampering, fabrication." She paused. "It turns the weapon around." The room was very quiet. Vasile and Luca exchanged a look she couldn't fully read. Not a look of surprise, but of confirmation. The look of 2 men whose calculation has arrived at an answer they already suspected. "That's the play," Vasile said quietly. Luca said nothing. His jaw was tight. He was somewhere behind his eyes, and she had enough experience with him by now to understand that the deeper he went behind his eyes, the worse the thing he was turning over. "I need to check the drive," she said. "Tonight. I need to compare what's on it against—" "What?" Luca said. "I sent copies." She said it before she'd decided to. "Before I left Chicago. Not the full files, fragments, account numbers, correspondence headers, things that would only matter if you knew what they corresponded to. I sent them to an address that isn't connected to me." She paused. "I can cross-reference. If the drive's been altered, the discrepancies will show." Luca looked at her for a long moment. "You've been planning for this," he said. "I've been planning for everything," she said. "For 14 months. That's what you do when you're running." Ricci called from the apartment at 11:40. Evelyn was in the study with Luca and Vasile, the drive plugged into a laptop that belonged to a man Vasile had called and who had arrived within 20 minutes carrying a case that was not the case of a man who worked in EAT professionally. He was young and thin and did not make eye contact with anyone and worked with the focused speed of someone who billed by the problem rather than the hour. Vasile took the call in the corridor. He came back after 2 minutes. "Microcamera," he said. "Behind the smoke detector in the bedroom. Already transmitting." He paused. "It's been active since Tuesday at minimum, probably longer." The information landed in the room without drama, which made it worse. Tuesday. She had gone back to the apartment on Thursday morning. 2 days of footage before she'd even entered the building. 2 days of an empty room, a nightstand, an outlet cover. And then the footage of her pulling the nightstand out, removing the plate, taking the drive, standing there for that single unguarded second with it in her open palm. "He saw my face," she said. "When I found it, he saw confirmation," Vasil said. "He already knew it was there. The camera was a receipt." She pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose, breathed. The young man at the laptop said something very quiet to Vasile, and Vasile looked at the screen and his expression did not change, but the quality of stillness in the room changed around him, and Evelyn looked up. "Tell me," she said. "The core files are intact," Vasile said. "Transfer records, correspondence, the shell company registrations. He didn't alter them." She exhaled. "But there's a second partition." Vasile looked at her directly. "Password protected. It wasn't there before." She stared at him. "Someone added a folder to the drive," he said, "while it was in the apartment, while you were living here, before you retrieved it." The young man at the laptop turned the screen slightly so they could see it. A folder icon, unnamed at the edge of the drive's directory. Clean. No metadata showing creation date. That had been stripped, which was itself information. "Open it," Luca said. "I can try to break the..." "Open it." It took 11 minutes. Evelyn sat in the chair across from the desk and did not look at the screen, while the young man worked because looking at something you couldn't yet see produced a quality of dread that was not useful, and she was managing her useful reserves carefully. She looked at her hands instead, turned the ring on her finger once, the oval diamond rotating against her knuckle. She thought about what Grant had said at the gala. "He's using you." The flat certainty of it. The way he always delivered the most corrosive things in the most neutral voice. The way he had said it was an accident to the detective on the phone, while she lay 8 feet away with 4 broken ribs. She heard the young man say something. She looked up. The folder contained 43 files. She went through them in order, standing behind the young man's shoulder, and she understood what she was looking at by the 3rd file, and understood its full implication by the 8th and by the 20th. She had walked to the window and was standing with her back to the room and her forehead not quite touching the cold glass. 43 files. Photographs, bank records, a series of encrypted communications that had been decrypted and printed as PDFs, all of them bearing the same name in various configurations: account holder, signatory, correspondence recipient. Luca DeSantis. Not fabricated. She knew fabricated documents. She had spent months learning to read the seam lines of constructed paper trails, the places where the texture didn't quite match. These had the specific density of real records, real transfers, real correspondence between Luca's financial infrastructure and 3 of the same offshore entities that appeared in the Holloway Foundation files. The same entities, the same accounts. Different years. The transfers predated the Holloway Foundation's involvement by 4 years, which meant one of 2 things, and both of them were devastating, and she stood at the window and made herself breathe through the specific terrible clarity of a differential that had only bad outcomes. Either Luca DeSantis had been doing business with the same trafficking networks that Grant's family used independently and prior to her arrival, which meant she had walked her son into the house of a man who was not a better version of the thing she was running from, but the same thing with a different face. Or the files were constructed, sophisticated, near perfect, but constructed, which meant Grant Holloway had prepared this contingency before she'd even arrived in New York, had spent time and serious resources building a parallel narrative that could be activated the moment she tried to use the original documentation, turning everything she had into a liability the moment she handed it to anyone. She heard Luca's voice behind her. "Evelyn?" She didn't turn around. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking about the differential." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. 2 possible explanations. One of them ends the same way Chicago ended. The other one is a trap so well constructed I can't tell it from the truth without information I don't currently have. A pause. Turn around. She turned around. His face was doing something she had not seen it do before. Not anger, not the controlled something she'd watched fill his eyes when she told him about Grant's hands at the gala. Something more exposed. A quality of being looked at that he had not chosen, was not managing, that was simply happening to him in real time. Ask me, he said. Are these real? No. How do I know that? He held her gaze. You don't. Not tonight. He said it without deflection, without the qualified non-answer she had been bracing for, and the directness of it was so clean it temporarily dislodged something in the careful machinery she was running. Tonight, you only have my word. Your word. And the fact that if I wanted to traffic people, I wouldn't need to partner with the Holloway Foundation to do it. He said it with a flatness that was not callousness. A man accounting for his own capacity accurately, without vanity. I have infrastructure they could only dream about. The partnership doesn't make operational sense. Criminals do operationally nonsensical things. They do. But I don't. He looked at her steadily. I know what those organizations are. I know what they move. There are things I do and there are things I don't do, and that category of thing is something I have never and will never. Then who made these files? He paused, and in the pause she watched him arrive at something. She watched it land on him with the specific weight of information that rearranged existing knowledge. Not new information exactly, but existing information arriving in a new configuration, the pieces falling into an alignment that had been blocked before. She watched his expression go from the exposed quality back to stillness, but a different stillness from his usual one, colder, more inward. He turned to Vasily. Get me Coretti's financials, he said. Tonight. Vasily's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. Luca. Now. Vasily looked at him for 2 seconds, the look of a man who had been beside someone long enough to know when not to push back, and left the room. Evelyn looked at Luca. Who is Coretti? He picked up his glass, found it empty, set it back down. Daniel Coretti, he said, my head of financial operations, 12 years with the organization. He manages every external account I have, every shell structure, every clean fund. He was looking at the middle distance, not at her. He's the only person with access to the account architecture that would be needed to construct those records convincingly. She stared at him. You think someone inside your organization? I think someone inside my organization has been in contact with Grant Holloway. He said it quietly and with the terrible precision of someone putting a name to a thing they had not wanted to name. And I think they've been in contact long enough to build something this detailed. The room was very quiet. How long? She said. Long enough. He finally looked at her. Which means they knew you were here before the newspapers ran. Which means information about your documentation, about your son, about the apartment. He stopped. She felt the cold move through her again. The camera, she said. Ricci found the camera in my old apartment. But this house. She was already moving toward the door. Evelyn. She took the stairs 2 at a time and was down the corridor and through the door of Noah's room in 14 seconds, and she was across the room and her hands were on the side of the crib before she'd finished the thought. And Noah was there, warm, breathing, fists curled against his cheeks, and she picked him up and held him so hard he made a small protest sound against her collarbone. She stood there in the dark room with her son pressed against her chest, and her eyes closed and breathed. Luca appeared in the doorway. He said nothing. She could see his silhouette against the corridor light. Someone in your house has been feeding him information, she said into the dark. Everything he did tonight, the gala, the message, the camera, these files, he knew where I was, he knew what I had, he knew my movements. She opened her eyes. Because someone in here told him. A long silence. Yes, Luca said. Who? I don't know yet. How many people knew I had the drive? He was quiet for a moment. 4, including you. Myself, Vasile, and 1 other. He paused on the last 2 words in a way that told her something. Not Vasile, she said. No. Then who is the fourth person? He didn't answer immediately, and the delay was its own answer. The specific delay of someone who was being asked to say a name they had not wanted to say, who understood that saying it would make it real in a way that thinking it hadn't. His name is Fabrizio, Luca said. He's been with me for 9 years. He's... A pause. He's the closest thing I have to a brother. She held Noah tighter. You need to find him tonight, she said. I know. Tonight, Luca. Not tomorrow. Not when you've had time to... I know. His voice was very quiet. I know. Vasile returned at 12:40 with Coretti's financials on a tablet and a face that had shed its professional neutrality, somewhere between the desk downstairs and the corridor outside Noah's room. He handed the tablet to Luca without speaking. Luca looked at it for a long time. Evelyn sat in the chair in the corner of Noah's room, holding the baby, and watched Luca's face in the corridor light, and watched it do the thing she had not seen it do before and never wanted to see again. The thing that happened when someone who had built a controlled internal world found the place where the control ended. His jaw tightened. Then it released. Then the stillness came back, but it was a different stillness now. The stillness of a decision rather than a disposition. He handed the tablet back to Vasile. Where is he? Luca said. 4th floor, Vasile said. He came in 2 hours ago. He doesn't know we... Keep it that way. Vasile nodded. Luca looked at Evelyn. Stay in this room, he said. Both of you. Lock it from inside. Don't open it for anyone except me or Vasile. She looked at him. What are you going to do? He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something in his face that was not theatrical, not performed, not the quality of controlled menace she associated with the way he occupied a room. This was simpler than that, and worse in a different way. The face of someone who was about to do something that cost them something real. What I should have done before any of this reached you, he said. He left. She sat in the chair in the dark room for a long time after he was gone, listening to the sounds of the house. Noah fell back asleep against her shoulder. The radiator ticked. Somewhere above her she heard footsteps. Not many, careful, the footsteps of people who were not trying to be quiet in the way of aggression, but in the way of precision, people who knew where they were going and did not want the building to know before they arrived. Then voices. Not the words, just the texture of them. A high corridor, she thought, or a room with good walls. The voices were low, and then they were not, and she heard a single specific sound that she had heard before in a different context in a different city, and that she identified before her conscious mind could redirect her away from identifying it. The sound of a person arriving at the end of something. Then quiet. She held Noah and breathed. She thought about the files on the drive, the real ones, the ones she had carried for 14 months, the ones that could end the Holloway Foundation if they reached the right people. She thought about the false files in the second partition, the constructed records bearing Luca's name, and she thought about the kind of preparation that took, the months of planning, the access required, the specific intimacy of the betrayal. Someone close enough to Luca to know his financial architecture. Someone close enough that the word brother had lived in his voice when he said the name. Grant had found the seam. Not in the arrangement between her and Luca, not in the documentation or the legal exposure or the political maneuvering. The seam in the thing underneath all of that. The human thing, the trust that people built with other people over 9 years. The kind of thing that felt like certainty until the moment it wasn't. He had found it, and he had pulled. And now something that had been whole was not. The lock on the door. She got up slowly, careful not to wake Noah, and crossed to the door and stood with her ear against it. Quiet corridor. She could hear the low electrical hum of the house, the faint sound of rain beginning again outside. Her phone buzzed. Luca. Come to the study. Bring nothing. Leave the door locked behind you. She looked at the message. She looked at Noah in the crib, settled on his back, arms above his head in the way of small people who had not yet learned to take up less space as a precaution. She set the monitor on the dresser and turned the volume up. She left the room, locked it behind her, and walked down the corridor toward the stairs, and toward whatever Luca's study contained now that it hadn't contained an hour ago. And she was 3 steps from the study door when it opened from the inside and Marco Vasile came out and stopped when he saw her. He looked different than he had at the gala. Not disheveled, he was never disheveled, but carrying something that wasn't usually visible on him, something that sat around his eyes. "He's ready for you," Vasile said. She looked at him. "Is it done?" A pause. "Fabrizio gave us everything," Vasile said. "The full scope of the arrangement. How long it had been running, what Holloway knew, and when." He paused again. "It's been going on longer than tonight, longer than this week." She stared at him. "How long?" 4 months. Vasile held her gaze without flinching. "He reached out to Fabrizio 4 months ago, before you arrived, before any of this." He paused. "He knew you were in New York, and he knew Luca had found you, and he..." He stopped. She understood. "He engineered it," she said. "Grant engineered the arrangement." Vasile didn't answer, which was an answer. "He wanted me here," she said, and heard her own voice go very flat and very certain. "He wanted me inside this house, connected to Luca DeSantis, on record as his fiancée. He wanted the photographs and the newspapers and the public record of the arrangement because..." She stopped. "Because then the documentation she carried didn't belong to a frightened woman running from an abusive family. It belonged to a Mafia associate. It belonged to someone who could be framed as a co-conspirator. It belonged to someone whose credibility as a witness was permanently destroyed by the company she kept. If I try to go to federal prosecutors now," she said, "I'm Luca DeSantis' fiancée. I'm on record as being connected to organized crime. Anything I give them gets filtered through that lens." She felt something cold and comprehensive move through her. "The documentation doesn't just fail, it makes me the target." Vasile said nothing. "He didn't come to New York to take me back," she said. "He came to New York to finish what he started in Chicago. He needed me discredited. He needed me here, in this house, in those photographs, before he could..." She stopped because the rest of it was arriving, and it was worse than the parts before it. "The gala," she said, "tonight. The confrontation at the gala. He approached me, he threatened me. He did it in front of the cameras and the press and a room full of people who..." She looked at Vasile. He wasn't losing control. He was making a record. The corridor felt very narrow. "He's already filed something," she said, "hasn't he? He's already given something to someone." Vasile's expression told her everything. "Vasile, there's a complaint filed with the Southern District," he said. "As of 9 o'clock tonight, Evelyn Ward, formerly of Chicago, Illinois, named as a material associate of the DeSantis organization. Conspiracy to fabricate evidence in connection with ongoing federal investigations into the Holloway Foundation." He paused. "It went in before the gala ended. He had it prepared. Everything tonight was performance," she said. She stood in the corridor with her back against the wall, and she looked at the ceiling and she breathed, and she told herself that panic was a physiological event, not a decision, and that she had trained herself to function through physiological events, and that she needed to function right now more than she had ever needed to in a trauma bay. Noah, the drive, the documentation, the complaint in the Southern District, the careful architecture of 14 months of survival, dismantled in a single evening by a man who had been building his countermove the entire time she had been building her escape. She pushed off the wall. "I need to see Luca," she said. Vasile stepped aside. She pushed open the study door. Luca was at the desk. He looked up when she came in, and she saw on his face what Vasile had been carrying. Not grief exactly, but the residue of it, the specific quality of a person who has just done something that cost them someone and is sitting with the... She closed the study door behind her. Luca was at the desk, and he looked like a man who had just walked through something and was still carrying the weight of the other side of it. Not broken. Nothing about him was broken, but compressed, denser than usual. The way metal looked after it had been through serious pressure and come out changed in its molecular structure rather than its shape. He looked up at her. She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him and put both hands flat on the desk between them. "Tell me what we have left," she said. Not, "I'm sorry." and not what happened to Fabrizio, and not any of the things that lived in the peripheral territory of the moment, because those things were real, and she would carry them. But right now, the only thing that mattered was the shape of the problem, and whether the shape had a solution. He looked at her hands on the desk, then at her face. "The original files are intact," he said. "The real transfer records, the shell company registrations, the correspondence. Holloway's people got access to the drive, but they didn't touch the original partition. They only added the second one, which means either they couldn't crack the encryption on the core files without leaving traces, or they didn't need to," she said, "because they already had the filing in the Southern District. They didn't need to destroy the evidence. They just needed to destroy the person carrying it." "Yes," she breathed through her nose. "What does the complaint actually allege?" He turned the laptop on the desk toward her. She read it. It was thorough. She had to give Grant that. Whatever else he was thorough. The complaint named her as a material associate of the DeSantis organization, alleged that the documentation she possessed had been fabricated in concert with Luca's financial team as part of a coordinated campaign to neutralize a political rival, cited her move into the estate as evidence of operational integration, and attached. She felt her stomach drop when she reached the attachments. 17 photographs taken over the course of the past 3 weeks, time-stamped and geolocated, showing her in and around the estate, in the car with Luca's men, at the gala, at the restaurant on 54th. Surveillance. Not the newspaper photographers. Someone closer. "How long has someone been watching the exterior of this building?" she said. "Apparently longer than I knew." She looked up from the screen. His jaw was working. It was the most undone she had seen him, and she understood that it was not about her or about the complaint or even about the operational exposure. It was about Fabrizio, about 9 years, about the specific pain of a betrayal that came from inside the architecture of your own trust. She understood that pain. She had her own version of it, smaller in scale, different in texture, but she knew its address. "The filing is in the Southern District," she said, "which means there's a federal prosecutor who's received it, which means we have hours," Luca said. "Maybe less. If they move quickly, which they will because Holloway has connections to that circuit." He stopped. "They could have a warrant by morning." "For me?" "For you, and for the estate. And if they execute the warrant on the estate and find you here with the drive, the real files become tainted by association. Everything becomes tainted." She looked at the laptop screen, at her own face in the surveillance photographs, the navy dress, the silver dress, the ordinary clothes of ordinary mornings, all of them assembled into an argument about who she was that bore no relationship to who she actually was. This was the thing Grant had always understood about her, that she had never quite understood about herself. That the story told about you by someone with enough resources and enough patience was harder to fight than any physical threat, because you couldn't put your hands on it, couldn't apply direct pressure, couldn't stop the bleeding with skill and steadiness. It moved through institutions and records and public perception, and by the time you saw it, it had already done most of its work. She pushed the laptop back across the desk. "Who do you have at the federal level?" she said. Luca looked at her. "Not prosecutors," she said. "Investigators. FBI, Treasury, anyone who's been building a case against trafficking networks independently. Anyone who already knows what the Holloway Foundation is and has been trying to prove it without the documentation to do it." A pause. Something shifted in his expression. "There's a task force," he said. "Financial crimes and trafficking. They've been working the offshore entities for 2 years. I know they exist because they've been brushing against my operations, and I've been managing the distance carefully." He paused. "I have a contact who knows someone on it." "That's not good enough." "I know. I need a direct line. Tonight. Someone who can receive the original files and act on them before morning, and who has enough independence from the Southern District Circuit to not be immediately contaminated by Holloway's filing." He looked at her for a long moment. "If I make that contact," he said, "I'm exposing a relationship I've spent years keeping invisible." "I know. It doesn't just affect me. It affects people inside my organization who—" "Luca." She held his gaze. "I know what I'm asking." The silence between them was the kind that contained a lot of things neither of them was saying. and she let it be that rather than trying to fill it, because she had learned in the past week that he thought better in silence than in conversation, and that the measure of his decisions was in the quality of the quiet before them. He picked up his phone. What happened in the next 4 hours happened fast, and in pieces, and she experienced it the way she used to experience mass casualty events, not as a coherent narrative, but as a series of immediate present moments, each one requiring full attention, each one replacing the one before it before she'd had time to process it. Vasily came in at 1:15 with a name and a number. A federal investigator named Sandra Cho, currently attached to a joint task force operating out of offices that were deliberately not in the Southern District building, who had been running the offshore entity investigation for 22 months, and who had, according to Vasily's contact, been waiting for the kind of primary documentation that could connect the entities to domestic Foundation activity. "She'll take the meeting," Vasily said. "Tonight?" Evelyn said. She said tonight or not at all. If the Southern District filing moves before she can act on her own authority, she loses the independent lane. He paused. "She wants the original drive and a primary witness." Evelyn looked at Luca. "That's me," she said. "That's both of you," Vasily said. Luca stood up. "Where?" he said. "She'll come here. 40 minutes. Get the car around the back. If we need to move Evelyn and Noah quickly." "Already arranged." Evelyn was already on her feet, moving to the door. "I need to check on Noah," she said, "and I need the drive." "Evelyn," Luca's voice. She turned. He was looking at her with something direct and unguarded, and she didn't have time to look at it carefully, so she took a fast inventory. Not fear in his face, not strategy, the other thing, and turned back to the door. 40 minutes, she said. Buket. Noah was asleep. She stood over the crib for 30 seconds with her hand on his back, feeling him breathe, and told herself this was the last time she would do this as someone running. After tonight, she would be something else. She didn't know the exact shape of it, but she knew running wouldn't be part of it. She had been running for 14 months, and she was finished. She got the drive from the inside pocket of her bag. She held it in her palm again, the small piece of plastic and metal that had cost her everything and was about to cost her more. And she thought about the night she'd copied it, the parking garage, Grant asleep upstairs, her own hands shaking badly enough that she'd had to press them flat on the steering wheel before she could manage the connection cable. She had been 8 months pregnant and terrified, and she had done it anyway. She had done a lot of things terrified. She put the drive in her pocket and went back downstairs. Sandra Cho arrived at 1:53 in an unmarked car with one other person, a younger man who carried a case that contained recording equipment and said nothing for the entirety of his time in the estate. Cho herself was 50, Korean-American, with a face that had processed a great deal of information over many years and had arrived at a quality of permanent alertness that was not unfriendly, but was not interested in anything extraneous. She looked at Evelyn first, then at Luca, then at the drive in Evelyn's hand. "Let's see it," she said. They sat at the long table in the dining room, the young man setting up equipment with efficient quiet, and Evelyn talked while Cho listened. And the thing that Evelyn noticed about being listened to by a person who was paid to find the truth rather than protect a position was that it felt different in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the sensation of weight redistributing after you'd been carrying it on one side for so long you'd stopped noticing the lean. She told it in order. The foundation, the transfer records she'd discovered, the night she'd copied the drive. 14 months. The apartment, the camera, the second partition, the filing in the Southern District. Cho asked 5 questions during the 40-minute account, each of them precise and structural, oriented toward establishing chain of custody and corroborating data rather than toward the emotional content of what she was describing. Evelyn answered each one the same way she'd given the account, flatly, accurately, without editorializing. When she finished, Cho looked at the drive. "If this is what you say it is," Cho said, "and my people can verify the integrity of the core partition before 6 a.m., I can have emergency authorization to move by 7. She looked at Evelyn directly. "You understand what that means for you?" "I'll be deposed," Evelyn said. "I'll be a primary witness. My name is on record." "Your name is already on record," Cho said, not unkindly. "The Southern District filing put it there. The difference is whether it's on record as a conspirator or as a cooperating witness who provided authenticated evidence of federal crimes. She paused. Those are very different records. I know. There will be people who don't want this to move, people with access to the kind of levers that slow federal proceedings down or redirect them. Cho glanced at Luca, a direct acknowledgement of his presence rather than a pointed one. I need to know that the evidence is clean, that there's no channel through which it can be characterized as operationally compromised. The question underneath the statement was clear. Evelyn looked at Luca. He met her gaze and held it, and she watched him do the thing she'd watched him do in the car after the gala. The going somewhere behind his eyes and coming back with a decision, and she waited. The documentation came from Evelyn Ward alone, he said. Her acquisition of it predates any contact with my organization by 14 months. I can provide records establishing her employment history, her residence history, and the sequence of events that brought her here. None of that documentation is generated through channels that can be characterized as tainted. He paused. My involvement is logistical, providing safety while she made her own determination about how to proceed. Cho looked at him for a long moment. That's a careful answer, she said. It's an accurate one. Another pause. Cho looked back at Evelyn. I'm going to need you available from 6 a.m. Whatever happens tonight, tomorrow you're in a federal building giving a formal statement. She stood. Don't go anywhere you can't be reached, and don't contact anyone outside this room until you hear from me. She took the drive. Evelyn watched it leave her hand and tried to identify what she felt. Not emptiness exactly, not relief. Something more like the sensation of a long-held breath finally being exhaled, the muscles around it aching from the duration of the hold. Cho and her associate left at 2:40. The estate was quiet. Vasily poured 3 glasses of something from the drinks cabinet and set them on the table without ceremony, and they sat with them in the silence of people who had just done something that could not be undone and were waiting for the shape of what came next to become visible. It came visible at 4:17 in the morning, and it did not come from the direction any of them had been watching. Vasily's phone. He looked at it and stood up from the table in a single motion that brought Evelyn and Luca both upright by pure contagion. East Wing, Vasily said. The monitors. They moved. The security room was on the ground floor, east corridor, a room Evelyn had passed a dozen times and never entered. Banks of monitors, a console, a man named Torres, who worked the overnight shift and who was standing when they came in with his hand already on his radio. 3 of them, Torres said. East wall, coming over by the garden access. They cut the exterior camera 30 seconds ago. I've got the gap on the recording. He pointed to one of the screens, which showed a gray void where the garden camera feed should have been. 2 more at the service gate, that's 5 total. Luca looked at the screens. Noah? Evelyn said. She was already moving. Luca caught her arm, not stopping her, redirecting. With me, he said. Don't run alone in this building right now. They went up the back stairs. Vasily was speaking into his radio behind them, low and rapid, the shorthand of men who had run this kind of drill. She could hear movement in the house, not panic, the organized movement of people who had been deployed, footsteps going to specific locations with specific purposes. She got to Noah's door and unlocked it, and was inside and across the room and had him out of the crib and against her chest before the light was fully on, and she stood there in the middle of the room with her son and her back against the wall, and she felt his heart against hers, and she thought with absolute cold clarity, not him, whatever it costs. Not him. Luca came through this door. We need to move you, he said. Where? 3rd floor, interior room, no exterior walls. There are 2 men already there. She moved. Down the corridor, up the half flight, into a room she'd never been in. Windowless, a library or archive of some kind, walls of filing cases. 2 men she recognized from the estate's regular security positioned at either side of the door. She went in and one of the men closed the door behind her, and she heard the lock engage. She stood in the middle of the room with Noah and breathed. She could hear things through the walls. Not clearly. The building was solid, old construction, thick plaster and hardwood, but she could hear the texture of what was happening, the movements, the brief voices. Once, a sound she identified and did not name. Noah was awake now, looking at her face with the unblinking attention of a child who reads environment through the body holding them, and was currently receiving information that he processed in the way of small people, gathering himself for a response. "Hey," she said quietly. "Hey, it's okay." He looked at her. "It's okay," she said again, and she was not sure which of them she was telling. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall of filing cases and held him and waited. It took 19 minutes. She counted them. She had a specific skill at estimating time without a clock, a trauma-based skill, the capacity to track duration under pressure. And she counted the minutes by breath and heartbeat and the sounds moving through the walls, which changed in character around the 11-minute mark and changed again at 17 and were different still at 19 when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the door and a knock that was specific in its rhythm. Vasil. She stood. The door opened. He came in alone, and she read his face before he said anything and understood that the 19 minutes had resolved in the direction she'd needed them to resolve. "It's clear," he said. "How many?" "5. The 2 at the service gate never made it in. Torres locked the gate down remotely." He paused. "The 3 in the garden are not going to be a problem." She looked at him. "Luca?" "He's fine." Vasile's voice was even. "He has a cut on his arm. He'll tell you it's nothing." He paused. "He's not wrong, but he'll want you to hear that from him." She found Luca in the corridor outside the study, standing with Torres and one of the other men, and she saw the cut Vasile had mentioned, left forearm, already wrapped in something improvised, the dark, spreading color in the fabric that she identified and cataloged as a professional before she cataloged it as anything else. "Show me," she said. "It's fine." Luca. He looked at her face and something in his expression shifted, the automatic deflection giving way to something else, and he held out his arm. She unwrapped the improvised bandage and looked at the cut and made her assessment. Deep but not arterial. Clean edge, not ragged, which meant a blade rather than a rough surface. 8 centimeters, maybe 9. It needed closing properly, needed cleaning, needed pressure maintained. She looked up at him. "Do you have a kit in this house?" she said. "Mrs. Caruso keeps one in the kitchen." "Sit down," she said. "I mean it. Sit down before you decide it's fine." He sat. She got the kit. She worked in the kitchen under the overhead light with Noah in the seat Torres had produced without being asked, and she cleaned the wound and closed it with the specific efficiency she had spent 6 years acquiring, and she was aware as she worked of his eyes on her face. Not pain in them, or not only pain, something that watched her in a way she could feel without looking up. She tied off the final closure and pressed clean gauze over it and taped it down. "You should have led with 'I used to be a trauma nurse,'" he said. "You already knew." Knowing and seeing are different things. She looked up then. He was closer than she'd realized. The kitchen table was small and she'd been leaning into work, and from this distance she could see the things his face was doing that it usually managed to keep still. The exhaustion under the control, the specific quality of a person who had been through a serious thing and was sitting on the other side of it while someone they didn't want to worry could see them. "It's almost 5, she said. "I know. Cho calls it 6. "I know." She collected the kit materials and put them back in the box and was aware of the quality of the room. The early morning kitchen quiet. Noah making small sounds in the seat, the house settling around them with the particular stillness of a building after crisis. Different from ordinary silence. Fuller, somehow. More present. "The men they sent tonight," she said. "Holloway sent them." "Yes." He knew about Cho. He knew about the meeting. She looked at Luca. "How?" His jaw tightened. Fabrizio's phone wasn't the only compromised channel. He said it quietly. "There's a second. I don't have the name yet." She stared at him. "Someone else," she said. "Someone with access to the communications between me and Vasily tonight. After Fabrizio, after we thought we'd closed it." He held her gaze. "I'm going to find it, but right now it means Holloway knows Cho has the drive," she said. "Yes. He knows she's moving in the morning. He'll try to stop it. Through the Southern District, through whatever federal connections his family has, through—" She stopped. He'll go to the source. He'll try to intercept Cho directly or compromise the authorization process before she can execute. She was thinking out loud now, the trauma bay processing, the differential running. She needs to know tonight. She needs to move up her timeline. She was already reaching for her phone. Luca's hand closed over hers, not stopping her, just there. She looked at him. "Before you call her," he said, "I need to tell you something." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, not the controlled something, not the deliberate stillness, something that was simply direct in the way of a person who had run out of the energy required for anything other than directness. "The men tonight came for you," he said, "not for the drive. Cho already has the drive. They knew that, which means they knew the drive was already beyond their reach. They weren't here to stop the evidence." He paused. "They were here because the complaint in the Southern District is the opening move, not the final one. If you die or disappear, the complaint stands and there's no cooperating witness to contextualize the original files. The case against them becomes static, a document dispute between a dead woman and a powerful family's legal team." His hand tightened slightly over hers. "You're the variable they can't control, not the drive." She understood. She had understood it at some level since the moment she'd read the complaint, but she had been managing the understanding, keeping it at the distance required to stay functional, and now it was here at full proximity, and she let herself feel the weight of it. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No. Not until this is resolved completely. Not until there's nothing left to cut." "I know." She looked at him, the kitchen light, the early morning, his arm on the table with the closed wound and her work holding it, his hand over hers. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Whatever I said in your study, the conditions, the room, the key, I've understood for a while that this isn't that arrangement anymore, whatever it started as." She paused. "I'm not telling you that changes anything I need. I still need Noah safe. I still need Evelyn. I'm still telling you that I know what this is." She met his eyes. "And that I'm not frightened of it." The kitchen was very quiet. He looked at her with the thing his face did when it stopped managing, the open, direct, uncalculated thing. And he said nothing, because he was a man who understood when nothing was the correct answer. She called Cho. Cho answered on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either, and Evelyn told her about the breach in 4 sentences, and Cho said one word, which was a word Evelyn wouldn't have expected from a federal investigator, and then she said, "I'm moving at 5:30. I need you in a car in 15 minutes. The warrant. I'm executing on emergency provisional authority. My supervisor is already on the phone." A pause. "The Southern District filing triggered a flag on our task force system 2 hours ago. I've been expecting a countermove." Another pause, shorter. "Get in the car. Bring the father of the child." The line went dead. Evelyn looked at Luca. She said, "I heard." He was already standing. "Vasil." Vasily materialized from the corridor as if he'd been waiting outside the kitchen door, which he probably had. "We move in 10, Luca said. "All of us." "There's still a second channel open," Vasily said. "Someone in this building. Then let them watch us leave." Luca said it with a specific flatness that answered a question Evelyn hadn't asked, and she understood that the second compromised channel had narrowed itself down to a name in his mind, even if not yet in his words. "Let them call it in. By the time Holloway can respond, we'll already be—" His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, the version of recognition that was worse than surprise. The recognition of something you had been hoping would not arrive. He answered, put it on speaker, slowly, and set it on the table. The voice that came through was Grant Holloway's, and it was the voice Evelyn knew from 3 years of listening to it calibrate itself for different rooms. The boardroom voice, the political fundraiser voice, the private voice that only she and he had ever heard, the voice stripped of its social surface. This was the last one. "I have 2 federal marshals outside Sandra Cho's building," Grant said. "Southern District authorization. They're going to take her into custody for tampering with an ongoing investigation in 40 seconds unless you get on the phone with me in the next 30. A pause. The drive, Luca. Hand it back through proper channels and I'll pull the authorization. Evelyn comes home, the complaint goes away, everybody walks. Another pause. 20 seconds. Evelyn felt the room compress. Luca's eyes were on her face. She looked at the phone on the table and she thought about Sandra Cho, 50 years old, 22 months of work, a task force that had been building toward exactly this moment, standing outside a building in the early morning with 2 federal marshals closing the distance. She thought about Noah in the seat 3 feet away. She thought about Grant's voice and how it sounded exactly the same as it always had, smooth and certain and waiting for the world to rearrange itself around his preferences the way it always had. She picked up the phone. "Grant," she said. A beat of silence. "Evelyn?" And there it was, the small, involuntary tightening of his voice, the thing that happened to it when she did something he hadn't anticipated. "This isn't—" "Stop the marshals," she said. "Or what?" She looked at Luca. He was watching her with an expression she could not fully read, the open quality from earlier and something underneath it, something that was waiting for her. Not waiting on her, waiting for her, the specific quality of someone prepared to follow where you led. "Or I walk into the Southern District building right now," she said. "Tonight, in the next 30 minutes. And I make a statement in front of every camera I can find before they process me. And in that statement, I describe every scar I got in your house and every conversation I had with your father about the foundation, and I name every judge and every commissioner who was at your engagement party, and I describe in specific detail the night your chief of staff told me to sign a non-disclosure agreement while I was still in the hospital bed." Her voice was level and cold, and she felt it as a physical thing, the precision of it, the steadiness of hands she'd spent years cultivating. "And then I hand the original drive to the first federal official who'll take it, and I let the authentication process run. And if it takes 6 months and destroys my credibility and doesn't result in a single conviction, at minimum, every newsroom in this country has my face and your name in the same sentence for the rest of your career." She paused. "Pull the marshals," she said, "or we find out which one of us has more left to lose." The silence on the line was 17 seconds long. She counted them. She could hear Grant's breathing. She had slept beside that breathing for 3 years, and she knew its rhythms, knew the specific pattern of a man who was running calculations, who was finding the edges of a problem and not finding an exit that worked. Luca's hand closed over her shoulder from behind. Not restraint, not direction, simply there. A specific weight and warmth that said, "I'm here in the plainest possible language." The silence stretched to 18 seconds. To 19. On the 20th second, something changed in the quality of the breathing on the line, and Evelyn Ward, who had once cleaned floors in a dead woman's name and hidden a flash drive behind an outlet cover and walked into a federal investigator's impromptu midnight meeting with her son in her arms, stood in a kitchen at 5 in the morning and waited for the shape of the 20th second passed, the 21st. Then Grant Holloway said, very quietly, "You won't do it." And Evelyn understood in that moment that she had miscalculated not the strategy, not the logic, but the man. She had spent 3 years learning his patterns and 14 months running from them, and she had forgotten the most fundamental thing about him, that Grant Holloway did not respond to equal force. He responded to superior force by doubling down, because the only thing he had ever feared was the world discovering that he was, at his core, a man who needed the world's fear to function. She had threatened him. He had heard it as proof that she was still afraid. "You won't walk into that building," he said. "You have a son. You have a case that's still contested. You walk in there tonight and you hand them a narrative where the Mafia boss's girlfriend comes in voluntarily to perform. It's theater, Evelyn, and the people in that building have seen theater before. They'll smile and take your statement and file it behind the Southern District complaint, and you'll spend the next 4 years in legal proceedings while Noah grows up and—" "Pull the marshals, Grant. And whatever borrowed safety you've convinced yourself is real, and by the time it resolves, you'll have nothing left that—" "Pull them now. No." Flat, final. The voice of a man who had decided. "Send me the drive through Luca's people by 6 a.m., or Sandra Cho gets taken into custody and your window closes. That's the only offer." The line was still open. She could hear him breathing. She looked at Luca. He was already on his phone. A different phone, she noticed, one she hadn't seen before, the kind of deliberate separation that told her it was a channel he kept for specific purposes. He was texting, not calling, his thumbs moving with the particular speed of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment to arrive and was now moving without hesitation. He looked up at her, gave a single small nod. She spoke back into the phone. "You have until 6 a.m. to pull those marshals, Grant. After that, the choice isn't mine anymore." She ended the call. Grant would interpret that as retreat. She knew how his mind worked. The ending of a call without capitulation registered to him as a stall, as someone going away to recalculate, as time he'd bought. He would spend the next 20 minutes feeling like he'd won the exchange. She needed 20 minutes. "Who did you just contact?" she said to Luca. "Someone who has been waiting for me to make this call for 2 years," he said. "Someone who knows where the Southern District authorization originated and has the standing to challenge it on procedural grounds before it's executed." He set the phone down. "It buys Cho time. Maybe 40 minutes, maybe an hour. Enough to move. And after that? After that, either the drive is sufficient and Cho's authorization holds, or it isn't and we're back to—" "It's sufficient," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "I know what's on it," she said. "I've known for 14 months. I've been carrying it because I was frightened, not because I had doubts about what it would do." She looked at him steadily. "It's sufficient. Cho just needs to get it to the right desk before his people can redirect it." Vasily appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Car's ready." "Noah?" Evelyn said. "Celia's already in the car with him," Vasily said. "He's fine." She looked at the kitchen one more time, the table, the first aid kit, the 2 glasses on the counter from earlier in the evening, and she thought that this was possibly the last time she would stand in this room not knowing how things ended, and she let herself feel that for exactly 1 second before she walked out. The drive to the federal building took 11 minutes. Cho met them at a side entrance with a man she introduced only as her supervisor, a heavy-set man named Garrett, who had the face of someone perpetually operating on insufficient sleep, and who shook Evelyn's hand with the grip of someone who had something to prove, and then looked at the drive in Cho's other hand and said, "Authentication is already running. I need her statement in the next 30 minutes." "She's ready," Cho said. Evelyn was ready. They took her into a small room, institutional, fluorescent, a table and 4 chairs and a camera mounted in the corner. And she sat down and she told it all again, for the second time that night, but this time to a man with a recorder and a legal pad who asked different questions than Cho had asked, more specific, more procedural, questions oriented toward establishing chain of custody and witness credibility in a way that would survive what she understood was coming. She answered every question. She was in the room for 51 minutes, and she did not look at the clock except once, and that once was at the 20-minute mark when she heard something in the corridor outside the room. Not an altercation, the managed sound of an argument being had at institutional volume, voices and counter-voices, the texture of someone being told something they did not want to be told. Grant's people. She knew it without seeing it. She kept talking. At 6:47 a.m., Garrett came back into the room and sat down across from her and put both hands flat on the table. "Authentication confirmed," he said. "The core partition files are unaltered and the metadata integrity is intact. We have a complete chain of custody from original acquisition through tonight." He paused. "The Southern District complaint has been flagged for jurisdictional review pending the new evidence filing. That review will take 48 to 72 hours, during which the complaint is procedurally suspended." She held the information in for a moment. "And Cho's authorization?" she said. "Executed. We have warrants for the Holloway Foundation's domestic offices, their primary financial institution, and 3 shell entities connected to the overseas transfers." He looked at her steadily. "This is going to move fast. There will be press. There will be a significant amount of attention on your name. I know. You'll need legal representation before the end of today." "I know." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had been in this room with a lot of people and was making a specific assessment of the one in front of him. "How are you doing?" he said. She considered the question. It was not the question she had been expecting. "Ask me in a week," she said. He nodded, as if that was the correct answer. Nyam. Luca was in the corridor when she came out. He was standing against the wall with his bandaged arm at his side and his jacket off. For the first time she could remember, just the dark shirt, sleeves pushed up, looking like a man who had been awake for a very long time and was not going to acknowledge it. Vasile was 20 feet down the corridor with his back turned, on his phone, the deliberate distance of a man giving space he understood was needed. She stopped in front of Luca. She looked at him in the fluorescent corridor light. The planes of his face, the exhaustion he was managing, the cut on his arm visible below the rolled sleeve, the specific quality of his eyes which were on her face with the same directness they always had, steady and complete. The eyes of someone who had not looked away from her once through any of it. "It held," she said. "I know. Garrett called. The warrants are executing. I know." She looked at him. "What happens to you now? With Cho, with the task force? They know you were involved. They know the channel you used tonight to block the Southern District authorization." He considered this with the same quality of directness he gave everything. "I have exposure," he said. "I've always had exposure. Tonight added a layer, but it also added something on the other side of the ledger." He paused. "Cho's a practical person. Practical people understand the difference between someone who created a problem and someone who helped solve one." "That's optimistic for you." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I'm making adjustments." She looked at him for a long moment in the corridor, and she thought about 14 months of running and the specific way a person's life could narrow to a single point of survival. And she thought about the study and the kitchen and Noah's room and the particular weight of a hand at the small of her back. And she thought about Fabrizio's name said in a voice that carried 9 years of something. "I'm sorry about Fabrizio," she said. His jaw tightened once, released. "Don't be. That's mine to carry. You can carry something and still have someone be sorry about it." He looked at her, and the something she had been not examining carefully for a week was right there in his face, not managed or controlled or deliberate, just present. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said. She wasn't sure exactly what she knew or what he'd been about to say, but it felt true anyway. Grant Holloway was taken into federal custody at 8:14 a.m. at his penthouse on the 63rd floor. Evelyn was in the car with Noah when Vasile's phone buzzed with the information, and Vasile read it and turned slightly in the front seat and told her, and she held Noah against her chest and looked out the window at the city going about its morning. People on sidewalks, coffee cups, and briefcases, the indifferent machinery of an ordinary day. And she waited to feel something specific, and what arrived was not what she expected. Not relief, not satisfaction, not the clean resolution she had been carrying as an abstraction through 14 months of running, just a slowing, a deceleration in her chest, the sensation of something that had been wound very tight for a very long time, beginning, at last, to loosen. She pressed her lips to the top of Noah's head. He smelled like the specific smell of him. The warmth of a person 5 months old, clean and immediate, the whole uncomplicated fact of him. And she held that fact and breathed. Grant's father, she learned by afternoon, had retained a legal team and was not yet in custody, but the Foundation's accounts were frozen and the indictment was being prepared. 3 of the overseas entities had already been flagged through Interpol. The man who had served as the Foundation's chief operations officer, the one who had placed the flash drive in her hand during the signing of papers she now understood were designed to bind her rather than protect her, had been on a flight to London when the warrants executed and had turned himself around at the request of people who communicated through channels above the airline's awareness. The gray suit man from Grant's penthouse, whose name Evelyn had never known, was cooperating. The detective from Chicago who had written her fall report in the wrong order had resigned by noon. She learned these things in pieces across the day, sitting in the estate's first-floor sitting room with Noah in the seat beside her and a cup of coffee that went cold while she was reading. And she processed each piece the same way she had processed information in the trauma bay, as a data point rather than an emotional event, stored and categorized, the feelings attending each piece filed in the place she was keeping them until she had enough stillness to go through them properly. Luca came in at 2 in the afternoon and looked at the cold coffee and took it away without comment, and returned with a fresh one, and she looked up at him. "Sit down," she said. He sat. The second channel, she said. The one you hadn't identified yet. When we left this morning. A pause. Torres, he said. The overnight security man. She absorbed that. How long? 6 weeks. Holloway approached him indirectly, through a third party. Torres needed money for something specific, and he found the wrong solution to it. He said it with the flatness of someone who had arrived at understanding without sympathy, and she found she shared both qualities. What happened to him? He's been let go. Luca looked at her steadily. I'm not going to tell you more than that. She accepted it. She had learned to identify the boundaries of what she needed to know, and she had learned to respect them. What about Vasile? She said. Luca looked at her. What about him? He knew about me before you told him. He came to me in the corridor and asked whether I was worth it. She looked at her coffee. He was asking a different question. A pause. He was asking whether I was going to be careful, Luca said. Whether I was going to cost myself something I couldn't afford because of something I hadn't fully examined. He paused. He does that. Has done it since I was 28. Is he right? He's usually right. Is he right this time? Luca looked at her across the sitting room in the 2 o'clock winter light that came through the south-facing windows and lay flat across the floor between them, and he said, No. She held the word for a moment. Because, she said, because what I haven't fully examined and what I've cost myself are 2 different measurements, he said, and I'm clear on both of them. The formal statement to the task force happened over 2 days, the second of which was attended by a federal attorney named Simone Okafor, who had been recommended by Garrett and who arrived with a leather case and an expression of precise professional competence, and who listened to the first 20 minutes of the second session and then intervened in a way that changed the shape of the remaining proceedings entirely. Okafor was sharp and expensive, and she told Evelyn on the second morning, in a corridor outside the statement room while Garrett got coffee, that the Southern District complaint had been formally withdrawn as part of a negotiated arrangement that also resulted in the suspension of the federal attorney who had filed it without adequate independent verification. He filed it on the basis of information provided by the Holloway family's legal team, Okafor said. The information was partially fabricated. That's a professional conduct matter of some severity. She said it without drama. You're no longer named in any active federal proceeding. Your status has been revised to cooperating witness. Evelyn leaned against the corridor wall and processed this. How long before Grant's case resolves, she said. Criminal proceedings take time, 18 months to trial at minimum, likely more given the scope. Okafor looked at her steadily. But the civil protection order you file through family court for yourself and your son is a separate and much faster track. I'd like to file that today. Yes, Evelyn said. Do that. The protection order was filed that afternoon. 3 weeks later, a family court judge granted sole and permanent legal custody of Noah James Ward to his mother, with no visitation rights or parental claims accorded to Grant Holloway, who did not contest the filing through his legal team and whose cooperation on this specific point was noted in Okafor's paperwork with a carefully neutral adjective that Evelyn understood to mean was advised in strong terms not to contest. She sat in the courtroom afterward, a small municipal courtroom, nothing like what she'd imagined, just a room with a seal on the wall and fluorescent lights and a judge who signed the document with the same efficiency he brought to everything, and she held the paperwork and felt the weight of it. Okafor sat beside her and said nothing, which was the correct thing. After a while, Evelyn folded the documents and put them in her bag and stood up. Thank you, she said. That's what you hired me for, Okafor said. Hint. She told Luca that evening. He was in the study, where he usually was in the evenings, and she came in without knocking. She had stopped knocking a week ago, had not made a decision about it, had simply found herself no longer doing it, and she sat in the chair across from the desk and put the custody documents on the surface between them. He looked at them, then at her. It's done, she said. He picked up the documents, held them. The lamp threw its circle across the desk, and outside the windows Manhattan was doing its nighttime thing, lit and dense and indifferent and enormous. And in the room there was the specific quiet of two people who had been through something together and were now sitting on the other side of it. He set the documents down carefully, precisely aligned, the way he handled things he considered significant. "What do you need now?" he said. She thought about the question. It was the right question, which she had come to expect from him. "I need to find a place to live," she said. "Somewhere that's mine, not borrowed." He nodded. "I need to work," she said. "I had my nursing certification in Illinois. I'll need to transfer it to New York, which will take time, but I need to start the process." She paused. "I need Noah to have somewhere he goes when he's old enough, somewhere that's ordinary and consistent and that he associates with things being stable." "Those are all things that can happen," Luca said. "I know." "Do you need help with any of them?" She looked at him. "Some of them." He held her gaze. There was something in his face that was the version of him she had come to know best. Not the public stillness, not the deliberate quality he brought to rooms full of people he was managing, but the other version, the one that appeared in kitchens at 5 in the morning and corridors outside federal buildings and here, in this room, across this desk, lit by this lamp. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask?" "What you said in the car after the gala, that Marco was partially right and that you were clear on what you'd cost yourself." She paused. "Were you?" He considered her for a moment. "I knew when I sent Ricci to pull the sedan footage the morning you retrieved the drive," he said. "I already knew what I was doing and why, and I knew the second measurement Vasily was worried about." He paused. "I've been clear since then." She looked at him. "That was 3 weeks ago," she said. "Yes." "You didn't say anything. You were managing a significant number of active crises." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I have some patience." She laughed. It came out unexpected. Short, genuine, the kind of laugh that arrived without preparation. And it surprised her enough that she felt it in her chest even after it was gone, the physical fact of it, the way it had moved through her. She hadn't laughed in a long time. Luca watched her with an expression she had no name for and did not try to name. "I'm not a simple person to be involved with," she said when the moment settled. "I've noticed. I have a child and a federal case and approximately nothing except the clothes I brought in 2 bags and a nursing certification that's technically still valid." She looked at him steadily. "And I have things I need to work through that I haven't started yet, things from before. Things that don't resolve just because the external situation does." "I know." "Do you?" "Evelyn." He said her name the way he had said it since the beginning. The real name, the whole name, with the specific weight of a person using language to mean exactly what they said. "I'm not offering you something simple. I'm not offering you something without cost or complication or the kind of history on my side that—" He stopped, started again. "I'm a man who runs a criminal organization and recently discovered that 2 people he trusted for a combined 20 years had been working against him. I have my own things I haven't started yet." She looked at him. "What are you offering then?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Something real," he said. "Whatever that looks like from here." She held that, something real. It was not a promise she could audit, not a guarantee she could file in a drawer next to a custody document, not something with the clean legal edges she had been trying to build around herself for the past several weeks. It was a person in a chair across a desk in a lamplight room saying a true thing without ornament. She knew the difference between that and the alternative. She had lived in the alternative for 3 years and had the scars to catalog. "Okay," she said. "Bon." She found an apartment in 6 weeks. Brooklyn, Carroll Gardens, the 3rd floor of a building that had been renovated in the way of buildings that respected their own bones. Original hardwood, high ceilings, windows that faced west toward the harbor. It was not large. It was hers. She transferred her nursing certification in 8 weeks. It took 3 months after that to find a position, a pediatric floor at a hospital in downtown Manhattan, which felt like a choice made by something below the level of conscious decision, some instinct toward fitting the work to the person she had become rather than the person she'd been when she started. She began the following Monday. Noah had become, in the months since the estate, a person with opinions about his environment. He had opinions about light and noise and the specific textures of things he was given to hold, and he communicated these opinions with the directness of someone who had not yet learned that the world expected you to manage your needs quietly. She found this clarifying. She found most things about him clarifying. She took him to the apartment on moving day, just the two of them with the boxes, and she sat on the floor of the empty living room with him in her lap before any of the furniture arrived and looked at the west-facing windows and the late afternoon light coming through them, and she said out loud to both of them, "This is ours." He looked at the light. She looked at him. It was enough. Luca came to the apartment for the first time 6 weeks after she moved in. She had cooked, which had surprised her when she started doing it. She had not cooked in years, had not had the version of stillness cooking required. But she had found in the months since everything concluded that the stillness was returning, not the forced stillness of survival, something more genuine and less managed. She cooked and she ate at a table, and she slept without the 40-minute intervals, and when she woke in the night to check the monitor, it was habit rather than terror. And the difference was everything. He arrived at 7, with a bottle of wine he had chosen, with the same deliberateness he applied to everything, and he stood in her apartment doorway for a moment looking at the space, the boxes still partially unpacked, the Noah infrastructure spread across the living room, the evidence of a person arranging a life rather than managing a crisis. And his expression did something she had come to recognize across the months they had spent in the particular proximity of two people who were taking something slowly because it deserved to be taken slowly. "Come in," she said. He came in. He was not the same as he had been in October. She had watched him change across the winter and spring, watched the things that had been compressed and controlled begin, gradually, to take up their natural volume. It was not softening. She did not think he would ever be a person described as soft, but a different quality of presence, less managed, more willing to occupy the full dimensions of a room. The criminal case, from which she had been deliberately maintaining distance, was moving through its early stages with the particular grinding slowness of large federal proceedings. The Holloway Foundation had been formally dissolved in January. Grant's father had accepted a plea agreement in February that carried with it a disgrace so comprehensive and public that the specifics felt, to Evelyn, almost beside the point, not because they didn't matter, but because the thing she had needed was already done. Had been done the morning Garrett said authentication confirmed, and the subsequent legal machinery was a validation she didn't require in order to know the thing was true. Grant himself was awaiting trial. She thought about him sometimes, not often, and not in the way she used to think about him, the nighttime thinking, the adrenaline thought. She thought about him the way she thought about a case she had handled in the trauma bay, a person she had worked hard to keep alive despite very limited desire on the part of the situation. She had done the work. The outcome was what it was. She had moved rooms. She set the wine on the counter and found 2 glasses and poured them and handed one to Luca, who was standing at the west-facing window looking at the harbor, at the water going dark in the early evening, the lights beginning to come on across the far shore. She stood beside him. Noah was asleep in the back room. The monitor on the counter showed a steady pattern of the small breathing of a person who had decided the day was over. Outside, the city was doing what it did, moving and lit, insisting on its own continuation, indifferent to specific histories. "Marco sends his regards," Luca said. "Does Marco do that?" "He texted me the word regards and your name." A pause. "For Marco, that's effusive." She smiled. They stood at the window with their wine and the harbor and the monitor's soft static, and she was aware of the specific quality of the moment, the way it was made of ordinary things, glass and light, and another person's shoulder almost touching hers, the warmth of a room that had been made habitable by work and time. And she let herself be inside it without cataloging it, without measuring it against what it had cost, without holding it at the distance she had learned to hold things, just inside it. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "I stopped being afraid of this a while ago," she said. "I kept waiting to be afraid of it because it seemed like the reasonable response, and I'm generally a reasonable person." She looked at the window, at the reflection of the room overlaid on the city beyond. "I'm not afraid of it." "No," he said. "I know. I'm telling you because I needed to say it out loud. Not because I need you to respond to it. I know that too. She looked at him. The lamp behind them and the harbor in front of them and his face, the familiar planes of it, the eyes that had been watching her since a corridor in October when she was scrubbing floors with a name that wasn't hers. I'm glad you asked the question, she said, that night, in the corridor. He looked at her steadily. I was going to ask it again, he said, if you'd walked past. I know, she said. She turned from the window, picked up her wine, moved to the couch where the city was visible through the glass, and where the monitor sat on the table, and where the apartment held its ordinary warmth around them, this place that was hers, that she had chosen, that contained the specific and unremarkable materials of a life that was actually being lived rather than survived. Luca sat beside her. Not managed, not performed, not the arrangement of two people occupying a function, but two people sitting in a room together at the end of a long story, in the particular quiet that came after everything had been paid for, and what remained was simply what was real. Outside, New York moved through its evening as it always did, carrying its 10,000 stories, indifferent to any of them, enormous and continuous and lit. Inside, a woman who had once hidden bruises under a uniform and slept with her phone face down in case the wrong person called sat with her wine and her monitor, and the man who had looked up from a staircase and asked the right question, and she breathed without counting the breaths, and she did not check the door. The city continued below them. The harbor held its lights, and somewhere in the back room of an apartment in Carroll Gardens, a small person slept in the uncomplicated way of someone who had been kept safe so many times and in so many ways that safety had become simply the nature of the world, the water they swam in, the air they breathed, the thing that did not require naming because it had never, not once in their entire small life, been otherwise. That was what it had cost. That was what remained. It was enough.